Quickly before this interview begins, two things. One, the morning of this interview, just before this interview, my mic failed me. I had no idea what the problem was, but my computer said it was still recording audio, so I went for it. And in post-production, unfortunately, my side of the audio is very scratchy. That problem was immediately corrected when I got a new mic later that day, so you won't have to worry about that issue again, but bear with me on this one. Thankfully, Carl's audio turned out great. The second thing is that I am still working towards being better with setting up my video situation for the YouTube video aspect of this podcast. That said, my new lighting situation in hindsight did not pan out very well, and my nose ring is crooked, which makes me feel self-conscious and dorky. But I feel good about the intro, so I'm just going to leave it and leave you to tease me if you need to. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. This podcast seeks to provide insightful, educational, and entertaining conversations that contribute to the growth and development of psychedelic culture. That said, I do not encourage the use of drugs here. I encourage education. I encourage what Paul Austin from the Third Wave podcast calls psychedelic literacy. It is only an open and intelligent dialogue that we can co-create an easily accessible cultural knowledge around psychedelics that not only mitigates harm, but accentuates the potential benefits. Those kinds of conversations are what I seek to offer here at Adventures Through the Mind. So thanks for tuning in. I am your host, James W. Jesso. Today's guest is Carl Abrahamsson. He is a Magico-anthropologist, and his new book, Occult, is a collection of essays and transcribed lectures that explores the history of occult influences on mainstream culture. His book was really entertaining, educational, but I really just enjoyed it. Some of the ideas that I was presented with when I read it were really juicy, and I was pretty excited about having him on the show, and even more excited when I realized that we had a really good rapport. There was lots that stuck out for me, but one thing that really stuck out, and you'll get to, is this clear differentiation between what a ceremony is and what a ritual is and what they're for. I guess I had never really considered those differences, which is strange because I think about the concepts regularly. So I really feel like he helped unlock some new language for me there. Of course, there's a lot more to explore in this interview, as you will see and hear soon enough. But before we get into it, I would just like to extend a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are written in the upper left-hand corner of this video on YouTube and in the show notes to this episode. I'd also like to give a thanks to the people who are leaving one-time donations via PayPal or via cryptocurrency, and a particular thank you to Michael from Australia for your significant donation. If you, the listener, are enjoying these episodes and the larger body of work that I am producing through Adventures Through the Mind, I invite you to please head over to check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/James W. Jesso, and become a patron here of Adventures Through the Mind. You can also leave one-time donations, as I mentioned earlier, and links to all of that will be provided in the description to this episode. Thank you in advance for doing so. So if any of you have been to the Patreon page, you will see that although I am earning a significant amount that I feel very, very grateful to earning, I am also less than halfway to my basic funding goal, which would enable me to continue to invest in this podcast and even increase my investments into it without slowly but somewhat gracefully dwindling down my savings in order to provide the content for you. Now, no guilt involved. I want you to support me if you're inspired to, and that's it. No, I don't want you to do so because you feel like, oh, he really needs it. No, I want you to do it because you love this content. That said, I also recognize that patronage is for some people and it's not for other people. And there's different ways that people can be excited and feel, enthusiastic about supporting the show. And one of those ways is through merch. Now, previously, the merch that has been available through the show has been my books, Decomposing the Shadow and The True Light of Darkness, which I've mentioned many times. But I've just actually created a new piece of merch, which is a limited availability, and it's in celebration for the upcoming Bicycle Day, which is April 19th. So this is the first public announcement, other than like a sort of semi-secret announcement that went out through my Instagram, which is that currently the first official available merch for Adventures Through the Mind is limited edition custom blotter art. There is only 100 of these that have been made. Each of them are signed and numbered by me, and they are made on chlorine-free paper with what was it called? Litho off-press something with vegetable inks, which means they're entirely safe to consume. That said, I'm not encouraging you to consume them because they're art. There's no contact with drugs in any way. And of course, I wouldn't encourage you to contact it with drugs. I would encourage you to frame it. So I'm very excited about this new merch product and about the launch of a merch store on my website, jameswjesso.com. So yeah, very excited. Anyways, you can find links to get one of these limited edition blotter art prints via a link in the description to this episode. Thank you very much. Not only is it going to contribute to further investments in the podcast, but as you heard in the last episode, I'm going to Europe, and that's really exciting, but it's not an all expenses paid trip. So you would also be supporting, I guess, a bit of a fundraising campaign to ensure that I can invest in the necessary technology to get lots of great interviews while I'm on the road in Europe this summer. So that's it for the intro. Thank you for giving me your time and attention to announce that very exciting piece of news. Please enjoy this episode with Carl Abrahamsson here on Adventures Through the Mind. Carl Abrahamsson is a writer, publisher, magico-anthropologist, filmmaker, and photographer. Since the mid-1980s, he has been active in the magical community, integrating occulture as a way of life and lecturing about his findings and speculations. The editor and publisher of the annual anthology of occulture, the Fenris Wolf, is that correct?
Yep.
And the author of Resonances, is that also correct?
That's also correct.
Okay. He divides his time between Stockholm, Sweden, and New York City. Welcome, Carl, to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So, although the title of your new book is called Occulture, let's kind of like narrow it down into the root of it all and start by defining some terms. What is occult and what is magic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those two questions are quite ambitious, but the first one, the occult one, is actually quite simple, because there we can go from like an etymological level and just see to what does it actually mean in Latin, because it's a Latin word and that means hidden. So the reason why all of this hocus pocus or all the magical stuff has been deemed occult is because it's been underneath the surface of various cultures all over the world. So it has become like a signifier for something that is not out in the open, and that can of course mean a lot of things, but the main meaning, at least in our cultural sphere, has been one, containing some kind of weird experimental proto-science and hocus pocus, but also things like curing and healing and all these things, and also social activities in these strange fraternities and witch covens, and it can mean a million different things. But the actual meaning of the word is hidden, and we can return to that, the hidden aspect, when we've delved into the magic one, because magic is of course has been defined by thinkers and philosophers and magicians, of course, and enemies of magicians all throughout history and in different cultures. So that's kind of a tougher nut to crack. And one of the main synthesizers of magical thinking and magical science in a way. Aleister Crowley, the British magician and chess player and poet, he came up with a pretty good definition, which was like typically 20th century, I'd say. He said that magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And, you know, it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of almost materialist. You know, it's sort of stripped from all spiritual trappings and even, in a way, magical trappings from a historical romantic point of view. He was saying that whatever you do, in his philosophy of will, whatever you do that is moving onwards to the manifestation of your will, that is a magical act. That could be, you know, studying at the university, or helping someone who you know will help you, or actually doing some kind of hocus pocus ritual, or just being a diligent worker, be at work because you know there's a promotion coming up that you want to have. So in that sense, it's a good definition. But as I said, I find it almost, you know, pseudo materialist. It's kind of stripped of all the beautiful romantic trappings of what I call hocus pocus. But if we look historically, you know, what is magic? I would say that very much it's been some kind of proto-science, you know, science before it became accepted by our specific cultural sphere and our time. And that goes for, you know, physics, chemistry, medicine, all of the, and astronomy, all of these things have at one point in time, and not even that long ago, been deemed as hocus pocus, been deemed as dangerous, satanic, you know, having to do with the devil and all these kinds of, you know, Christian fantasies in a way. But still, the things that have been underneath the magic umbrella now constitute our natural sciences. So I think magic is just some kind of it's a misnomer in a way. It's a very difficult, vague term, but I would love to actually define it as something that's ahead of the times. The magic that's going on now will be established as something else later on, in 50 years from now or 100 years from now. Because, you know, if you see the logical progression of how magic has been developed throughout, for instance, our Western civilization. That's exactly been the case, and there's no reason why that should change. You know, because there are many interesting things going on now, particularly in the natural sciences, that will take us way further out there or in here.
Right, like gene splicing and CRISPR and all these things.
And you know, Elon Musk's convertible in space, and you know, there are all of these things going on that for the layman or laywoman is just like science fiction. But that's exactly the way it's always been. You know, there's always been these pioneers, and they have, when they have crossed the lines, they have been, you know, scapegoated almost as some kind of, you know, devil's agents or whatever. I can't even imagine, because now everything is more free floating in a way, but I can't even imagine what it was like for Einstein, for instance, and those pioneering early 20th century physicists, you know, because they came up with some truly radical concepts that we even today have a hard time figuring out what the hell it means. So they had to battle not only that general attitude, but also the scientific community. And they brought on change that, it's affecting us today for real. And what I want to say is that it's not always some kind of, you know, Mickey Mouse magician or a classic magician like in Harry Potter with a wand or a strange robe or something. There have been many, you know, free thinkers and philosophers and, you know, proto-experimental scientists that have been true magicians, and they have helped humanity to progress, to refine their tools, to reshape their thinking, and we owe them. We owe that to magic.
Right. Even your book would suggest that you look at even the famous psychiatrist Carl Jung as a magician in some way or another.
Oh, absolutely. And I think like I write about in that particular text about Carl Jung, is that he was a pioneer, and he helped a lot of patients, and he helped develop this new science of psychology. But what he did was something remarkable that Freud, for instance, didn't do. Maybe he didn't want to, or maybe he couldn't, I don't know. But Jung became part of popular culture because he had these things, these terms they had this inherent meme quality, like all of these terms that people use nowadays frequently, that were integrated in his own, fairly scientific writings. But that kind of thing, and that he talked about myth and integrating art and myth in self-development. And I know you're fascinated too, like me, by the concept of individuation, which is basically a Jungian term. And I think that his onslaught coincided so well time-wise with the 60s and everything that was going on in the 60s, that Jung and his thinking and his own terms were sort of catapulted straight into truly the collective unconscious, but also the collective conscious of those times. And that gave him some headway in terms of, bringing forth his theories. And then, of course, he died during the 60s. But so Freud, that was more scientific in a way, he kept his thinking and his terminology and his theory and his practice within a specific psychological community, whereas Jung didn't seem to have a choice. He sort of branched out and did a lot of publishing and writing and lecturing, and also a lot of traveling and actively taking in these fairly irrational this irrational influx, specifically, magical things from other cultures, what we today call exotic, going to Africa, going to Asia, and being actually, confronted with these things, here with these people doing very irrational things in our Western eyes, from our point of view. But what they were doing to them made perfect sense. And that fascinated Jung for real. And I think that was kind of a bridge that made it easy for him to communicate with specifically with the post-World War II decades that he could live through. So I think Jung was a magician, absolutely. I'm not saying that, again, consciously, that he had a wand or a robe, but, he built his own house. He had a beautiful house, but he built another house in which he meditated, philosophized, and wrote. And he actually talked to pots and pans and stuff that he had in his house, and looked at it as some very, animistic, pantheistic kind of atmosphere, which of course is totally magical. So yeah, Carl Jung was a magician for sure.
So let's narrow in on that. When I think there are two things that come up when I think about magic, and one of them is, like you said, this Mickey Mouse, Harry Potter, wizards, Lord of the Rings, this kind of stuff, which is very reflective of how magic and hocus-pocus is represented in fictional media, or current fictional media. But then there's this other perception of magic, which looks like Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley, and magic spelt with a K on the end, the sex magic idea. And I imagine that most people tuning into my show are probably going to assume that that's what we're talking about, because that is obviously a lot more, strangely, a realistic concept to consider. For myself, what interests me about, well, there's several things that interest me about it, but insofar as the focus of this podcast, I'm curious about magical rituals and the principles of certain magical practices in that sort of Aleister Crowley, LaVey, say, scene, but looking at it from this Jungian psychological approach. Like, one of the earliest, I'd say, definitions or just rationalizations of magic that I understood was, just doing something that symbolically represented a change in your subconscious perception of things so as to align your autonomic choices and behaviors towards the accomplishment or acquisition of that thing, which is maybe fairly reduced and doesn't include any of the possible discussions on the nature of reality. But I think it's actually quite interesting, especially when we get into talking about psychedelics, which I'd like to ask you about later.
Yeah.
So maybe we can narrow in a little bit on this idea of magic as means to change and develop the sense of self and the psychology, with a particular focus on this concept of individualization that you mentioned earlier, which is a fairly primary theme in your book. First off, what is individualization? I know we already have an idea that it came from Jung, but it was also picked up by other famous magicians. So where does it come from? What does it mean? And how does it relate to the value of occult practices and magic?
Well, the value is high, and I think it's always been high. And one could present that theory by saying that it's been antinomian or antithetical to collective power structures in our Western sphere throughout the millennia, meaning that people who have their own ideas and who want to work and share their own ideas, but aren't allowed to because of external power structures. I'm thinking, of course, of the Christian Church, and the Christian Church is mingling with very harsh political forces and stuff like that, where conformity is very important. So then
including non-religious ones too, like extreme right, extreme left, Nazis, Marxists, this kind of stuff.
Absolutely, but I'm thinking way back in time, so sort of medieval times,
sure.
And earlier, and then onwards up to modern times. So it's not that strange, actually, that people who have been interested in these things, which is basically, if you want to take a look at it, it's trying to understand the macrocosm, trying to understand the bigger picture while looking at yourself, or vice versa. And here we can return to this again when we get to the psychedelic stuff. But that's basically been the core theme of it. You get to know yourself, and that was, even if we return to Delphi and the oracle at Delphi and the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece and stuff like that, where it said know thyself. The key has always been there in these alternative groups and societies and fraternities and sororities, meaning you go as an individual. You go on this symbolic journey within a structure or context, which is like a mystery or a living myth, as Joseph Campbell would say. And that's been there since time immemorial, even in Egypt, meaning before monotheistic times. And it's still around today. So you can't really, you can't erase that from the human mind or the human psyche or the human need. So I think that the eternal wisdom is that you can never learn these things by proxy. You have to learn yourself. And of course, the great revelation that comes then is that the language will be yours. You will see a reflection of yourself, and you will be the one defining that. And that's the problem I and many other people have with monotheistic or strong religious structures, is that it encourages a collectivistic thing. It encourages a proxy thing where you have priests doing the work for you. And that will never work out.
Yeah, you say in your book something along the lines of the value of a person defined by group association as a weak proclamation, or something along those lines.
Something along those lines. And that's not saying that those structures can fill a function. They can certainly fill a function culturally, and in terms of grief and chaos and catastrophe and things like that,
or existential angst.
Yeah, that too.
Right.
But that's more like social glue in a way, where you have like a therapist. Today, maybe people are more prone to go to therapists, psychologists, and or go into so-called alternative things like go out into nature, or go into some kind of shamanic trip, or even do yoga, whether it's pop yoga or Indian yoga or wherever. There are many. The palette is much richer today, much wider. You don't have to stick to a monotheistic religion to get that kind of spiritual fix in a way. But the Jungian thing and the trail that I'm on is very individualistic, and Jung call it individuation, and you can also say individualization, of course. It's basically that you have to refine yourself, because a life spent on just doing what other people tell you, they give you a name, they give you an identity. And if you live in that, there will be discrepancy. Most people experience the discrepancy very strongly when they're teenagers, but then they sort of adapt anyway. And also in terms of psychedelics, some people can go on very, heavy trips in their young years and become, totally immersed in a clarity and an insight and a realization about who I am, And when you know who you are, then of course you have a fairly good view of what you want to do as well. So when you have that clear vision and yet you don't follow that path, then of course you will be super neurotic, super frustrated, and that's like the foundation of as you called it, existential angst. It's as simple as that. So what Crowley did, and many LaVey too for that matter, they brought out these magical traditions, they synthesized them, and they clothed them very much in this sort of typically 20th century individualism. And I think it has brought many good things. It brought the 60s and the hippies, have to do your own thing, all that kind of stuff. But it also brought some pretty harsh, fairly negative things like harsh political liberalism and neoliberalism, which is basically rooted in very healthy ideas, but it becomes too narrow. You encourage people to have blinders on and not care about your fellow man in a way.
Right. So be clear, individualization is not self-servitude at the cost of all others.
No,
it's more of a psychological integration of who one's sense of self is.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And I think, the one very fine analogy is that something that it's so common for us to hear when we're flying, for instance, when the stewardess or the mechanical voice before we take off says that, if there's need for that oxygen mask that will, come, fall down from the ceiling, you have to attach your own mask first, because if you don't, you won't be able to help the kids, for instance, or people who need assistance. Because if your oxygen, if you can't think clearly, then you can't help anyone. However, if you attach your own mask first, you will be able to help many people.
This kind of reminds me of a sort of somewhat of a contentious fellow who talks a lot about Jungian psychology. I'm not sure how accurate it is because I'm not all that well read on the source materials with Carl Jung, but Jordan Peterson and his whole premise around, clean your room, fix up yourself before you try to change the world, because you're only just going to make a bigger mess.
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. I totally agree in that sense, because again, it's tied in with magical thinking in the sense you touched upon it before. There's a word for it. It's called sympathetic magic. It's when you do something in the small that will affect the big. When you do something sort of microcosmically that will affect the bigger picture, the macrocosm. And that's very much how traditional ritual has been taking place. Like for instance, these initiatory rites in different cultures and tribes, and even in modern societies, where the initiate goes on this strange little initiatory journey, during a ritual time, a ritual space. And in a way, you could see it as some kind of potent psychodrama in a way. The person in question willfully exposes him or herself to go through this thing, trusting the structure, trusting the context, and then coming out on the other side, and who knows if it has that effect. If someone goes through this thing super doubting and critical and totally rational, maybe it won't have an effect. Maybe the magical effect comes when we, give in to some kind of intuitive force that we have, saying, I realize that I'm going to go on this little symbolic journey, and it's symbolic, but it's symbolic of something that I want to achieve in the greater, in the outer. I can't do it by merely causal means. I need that extra, the grease of destiny, if you will. And you do that, I think, then you have a much higher, there's a higher probability that you will get some good results there. So what he said concerning the room, I think that's absolutely valid, and it's good advice, and it's wise, because if we are fragmented in our minds, we're chaotic or stressed, it's very hard to create some kind of super harmonious empire outside of it.
Hmm. Cool. So you're mentioning now like rituals and ceremonies,
Hmm.
which I feel like this pull. I want to ask you to explain. Like I want you to tell me something like dark and strange and weird, like the kind of stuff that like would most appropriately be represented visually by like H.R. Geiger or something. Like when I'm thinking about
Yeah, yeah.
the kind of things that might happen in a magical ritual, which obviously as you're describing, it's not maybe a fair characterization of
Mhm.
what a magical ritual will look like, but maybe give me an idea of like the magical ritual and the idea of ceremony, but staying into this underlying theme of individualization and the
Mhm.
development of the psyche. Because after this, I want to go into asking you about the role of sex and drugs within these types of
Mhm.
rituals.
Mhm. Sure, sure. No, I think that traditionally, when you look at those two things, ritual and ceremony, they're usually divided by um, the potential trajectory involved. A ritual is something you do in order to change something, either
Mm.
within yourself or in the outer, or both. By this sympathetic logic. Whereas a ceremony is something you do to uphold.
Mm.
It's something you do to uphold something. So, for instance, you could say that, for Americans, Thanksgiving, it's a kind of a ceremony, and
To
all
uphold
these
the
things that,
false belief that the Native Americans
exactly.
gave the land, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's exactly it. So, and many other things too that might be more, altruistic.
Right,
But
sure.
but that is kind of thing you do together with your close circuit, with your family, or even with your friends and things like that, to uphold a kind of energy that you can draw energy from in your own life, in a way. And in a more hocus pocus context, it could be like, well, let's stick with the monotheistic ones because there's a lot of magic in those too. I was
Hmm.
thinking specifically of the Catholic Church, for instance, when you have Mass. Is that a ceremony or is that a ritual? You could say that it's a ceremony to uphold the tradition and to give the believers, the people who come to church, a dose to get their fix of looking at the crucified Christ and whatever they need from that. But it's also a ritual when they take, when it's time for communion, because that's not, I assume, for most people, not really a super passive state where someone just forces something into your mouth. That's the time when you sort of focus your wishes and desires and truly, this is quotation marks,
Hmm.
where they pray.
Right.
Where they pray. There's a desire there. There's a wish there. There's a potential trajectory at work. So that could be seen as both. Whereas participating in singing a psalm in church, that would be totally ceremonial. And whereas you could also say that when you pray yourself to your God, whoever that God is, that's an act of ritual because you want to affect change by having that, perhaps two-sided communication with some higher force. And in terms of a more hocus pocus context, um, a ceremony could be seen as something you do together within the confines of some kind of temple, mainly to strengthen, for instance, fraternal bonds.
Hmm.
And the same thing, if you do a ritual together with other people, well, then one should assume that everyone present agrees
Hmm.
upon the object. Where is this energy going? And or maybe they help each other out. So more people than just one individual can do ritual together. That's not a problem at all, but it should have an expressed purpose or direction or a goal, because otherwise it's more of a ceremony where you simply uphold the communal bonds in a way. So that's explaining that dynamic in very simple terms.
Hmm. It's great. So then, okay, I'm just like thinking about like how do I transition into this next question? Because I think that there's a piece. Let me just go down through my notes. There's a specific term you use here about our capacity for willful and competent direction of energy, and I
Mm-hmm.
can see how both ceremony and ritual, are expressions of that. So,
Mm-hmm.
with that in mind, and of course, in our underlying theme of, say, psychological transformation in some way or another, um,
Mm-hmm.
let's look at sex and drugs, starting with sex, then into drugs, and then maybe both at the same time. From this perspective, what is sex and sexual energy, and what value does it have inside of a magical ritual or ceremony?
Depending on the tradition and the culture, it can have many different values or many different kinds of energies. If, for instance, it's being used within a sex-positive culture, then it could be seen as mainly an enhancer of ritual or magical energy. You get to the next level by integrating sexual elements in the ritual, just like you can do with psychedelics or other kinds of physical exhaustion or even calm meditation. It's about breaking down that rational mind that is, in a way, again, quotation marks, the enemy of a magical process. So if there's no problem about integrating sex, then it's very good to use it as an energy enhancer. And of course, everyone who's ever had an orgasm knows that that's kind of a peak experience where it's very hard to retain some kind of, rational mind frame.
Yeah.
And in that, I wouldn't say new, but in this magical theory and thinking that has been predominant these past, say, 150 years in the Western sphere, in the Western magical sphere, the idea is that specifically the orgasm is very conducive to what I call meta programming. You're programming yourself, and you're aware that you're programming yourself for magical purposes. So, but that's in a sex positive way. If you exist in a sex negative culture, and this is like taboo, and you can't use sexual energies for anything else but just procreation, then you could use it magically, first of all, again, as a magical energy enhancer, of course, because the dynamic between bodies is still the same. Or if you work on your own, that's fine too. But then you also have the aspect of taboo. And I've written about that in the book also, taboo and transgression, and these things where you sort of go against something, or you jump over a cultural hurdle or a moral hurdle, and that sets energy free, because it's almost like you could call that the naughty energy. When you do something that is not allowed, you're being naughty, and that can be a very liberating feeling if you get away with it. That is
right.
And most often when it comes to sex, you can get away with it because it's usually very confined to private spheres. So no matter what, the sexual energy is, of course, the ultimate procreative energy. I mean, not even symbolically, it's actually the most procreative energy we have. It can create new life.
Yeah.
So if you see that as a puzzle, with two parts, actually possibly infinite parts in the puzzle, but anyway, all it takes is two pieces of the puzzle to make actual new life. Then with those same pieces, you can also make other kinds of life. I'm not saying you can't breed other kinds of species or but you can create magical things, simply sending the energy into some kind of undefined womb of destiny, which you create yourself in your imagination. And that's something that mustn't be forgotten either. A key part of any successful magical career or operation or experimentation is, of course, the human imagination.
So why don't we go into that for a second? I have an alternative question too about taboos, freeing energy, and sort of things that Anton LaVey was sort of representing with Satanism, which I'd like to ask you at the end. But can you give me an idea of what you mean by imagination? Because I know that you're not talking about flights of fancy that have no place in the, quote, real world of us adults. You're talking about something else, something like very ancient in the human capacity, and something very important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's something that we have been a little bit terrorized for the past, say, 100 years. We've been terrorized by something called empiricism. And empiricism is actually something quite wonderful, because you want to have a scientific environment, you want to have your own laboratory, you want to test your theory, and you want to make it totally foolproof. You want to make it clean and there are no holes. There's no misgivings. It's just
It's objective.
theory.
Yeah.
It's more so as objective as it possibly can be. However, what these adamant empiricists, they always, complain about, the hocus pocus and magical philosophy. They can't see the trail of these proto-scientific thoughts that they now work with in their clinical labs. But the thing is that every idea, every empirical breakthrough where something becomes almost an objective truth in terms of scientific memes or thoughts, it has all begun on the level of speculation. So you can never escape that. Everything begins as a little seed to, again, go for the sexual symbolism. There's a seed which is like, where does this strange idea come from? And the scientists that have really, made headway and progress, they've trusted their own intuition concerning these seeds that come from, I guess, the subconscious. And they have gone with that, although every colleague and every institution and every university said, no, you can't do that. That's insane. But yet people do that. Even an entrepreneurial guy like Elon Musk sent his fucking convertible up in the space.
Right.
It's kind of amazing. Even though that's silly, it just goes to show that it's possible if you have a strong will and if you understand the dynamics of how to leave the atmosphere. It's possible.
Well, another good example there is it. Oh man, I'm going to sound like such a uneducated jerk now. But was it Copernicus who proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun?
Yeah.
And then basically was like, no. The church was like, liar. Lock him up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it would not even lock him up. There's so many brilliant people who've been killed by the Inquisition and Church, Giordano Bruno and a number of other people who just, they made the foundation for how we look at the world today. And they unfortunately had to pay the price of their lives. They were killed.
Martyrs for science.
Yep, martyrs for science. Exactly. So what I think I'm going with this is that perhaps in the magical sphere, there's a lot of speculation going on all the time because we're working with things that are absolutely intuitive, absolutely based in the imagination, absolutely based in dreams, fantasies, daydreaming. That's the fuel for our proto-scientific experiments that could take place not in a clinical lab, but in some kind of magical temple space. And that could, of course, be anywhere. It could be out in nature, in your own bedroom, or if you have a proper magical temple. It's the same process. We're trying to figure things out, and sometimes we're not using the same language. And I am also quite critical in the book about this arcane magical language, because a lot of people who come to it with an open mind, they get drawn in by the romance and glamour of these occult symbols. And
right, which is what came into my mind when I was like, tell me about Geiger style rituals. Tell me about the ancient glyphs, draw one for me.
Yeah. And Lovecraft and all these things and it's great. That's also fodder for the imagination. And someone like LaVey, who was such a super creative magician, he wove in those things because he wanted to have them because they give him pleasure and in a way magical energy in his temple space, in his what he called the intellectual decompression chamber. But for someone who is not dealing with the same kind of dark romanticism, it's totally fine to be, magically enthusiastic about current scientific exploits and sort of integrating that kind of technological or natural scientific language and terminology, because you have to. Again, there are different kinds of motors in cars. Some run on diesel, others run on regular gas, and some are electric. But the vehicles can still take you to your desired thing, but you have to know which kind of fuel fits your machine.
Right, and those are the kinds of things that you would be doing in the imagination to achieve either a ceremonial reinforcement of something or a ritualistic change or a direction towards change. But then just to clarify and really distill it, then what is the imagination?
I would say that the imagination is something not controlled by the causal, not controlled by the rational. I mean, of course, we can, with the rational mind say, now I'm going to think about this ideal scenario, and there will be some kind of faint vision or something. But as anyone who's ever daydreamt, and that's a wonderful thing to daydream. It's a kind of a free-floating thing, or also the hypnagogic state or the hypnopompic state, meaning the states before you wake up or before you fall asleep. They're wonderful states of mind where things and images and emotions just float freely. That's part of the imagination.
Right,
and then,
like
of course,
a wake-induced lucid dream, for example, would be an
exactly.
exploration of the imagination.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, or even a constituent factor of it, and I think that's it's simple in a way, because you could define it like this: if you can't with your own mind's eye, so to speak, paint the picture of your ideal desired scenario, then it's probably never going to happen, because then it will be stuck in some kind of super rational mind frame where language will be the formulating agent. And it's good, when interacting with human beings, it's great to say that, hey, I would like another cup of coffee.
Right.
And if the person in question is, speaking the same kind of language, and if they're nice, they will probably get you a cup of coffee. So, mission accomplished. But if there's more to it, if you have big existential things that you want to achieve, and you can't really say those things because people are too stressed to listen. Why should they do your bidding? They're busy with their stuff. So you have to formulate on a much deeper level. And that's where the imagination comes in. Let all those desires and also frustrations enter your mind frame and be filtered through your visionary ability. And then just something will come out of that, which will be a more clear, more pristine vision that could then possibly be formulated through other things like language. Like, for instance, if you have a vision of going to, a South Sea island, you need to go to a South Sea island because something good will happen there. Then, of course, you have to take that inner vision and then go online and get a flight ticket.
Right.
So you need to combine it with something very rational too, most often.
I'm thinking about this term, I believe, from the Sufi tradition, which is the imaginal, and that it's something very different than the idea, like the sort of modern rational perspective on what the imagination is, which is just pictures you make up in your head.
Yeah.
But it's actually like oh man, it's like a hologram room from Star Trek that you go in, but the programs that you're accessing aren't necessarily, you're not in control all the time. There's a degree of randomness, of chaos that you have to respond to, and that there's a skill set that we have as human beings, depending on whether or not we reinforce it, to actively engage it. We're not changing what's happening, but we're changing how we're responding and paying attention. And then, I mean, that might just be a very specific way of utilizing entering the imaginal, utilizing the imagination, but that's what's coming up for me.
Yeah, no, and I find that super interesting, because that way of looking at it could, of course, be applied to looking at what goes on in a magical temple when someone is doing a magical ritual. That's exactly the same kind of thing. It's not something that, I mean, a ceremony would be more controlled. People do things because they're taught to do certain things to uphold this energy, but a ritual needs to be ad-libable. You need to be able to improvise a little bit and go with the actual flow, not just like a saying, but actually go with the flow of the energy in that room. And again, something that would apply to that imaginal would also be the dream state, because to a varying degree, you can interact. Like, for instance, when you're just about to wake up in the morning, you can sort of hang on just a little bit and maybe go back, but then it's suddenly gone. But people who work with this and, try to strengthen their dream recall by making, as copious notes as possible when waking up, interacting with the dream mind, with the dream brain, I should say also, which is 1/3 of our lives. You can increase your dream recall, and that would also be a way to be more, not in charge, but at least have a little bit of a notion about how this works and what's going on and what you're experiencing.
Right. And that would contribute to a greater understanding of yourself and an integration of yourself, which then dream work and deeper understanding of the self goes back into that underlying theme of Jungian-esque individualization. I think I said that wrong.
No, but I know what you mean. And it's absolutely true. And I mean, Jung was great, but I think sometimes Joseph Campbell was slightly sharper, maybe because he was, fluent in English and he could, affect things. And also he lived longer than Jung. That was a good advantage. But he said something very, very beautiful about this. He said that dreams are private myths, and myths are public dreams. And in that sense, he tied it together, and Jung did that too. Beautiful way of looking at it in that sense, I think.
Beautiful. I got a little distracted here because I'm getting some lag, pardon me. But maybe that's a good invitation to shift back off of this incredible imagination tangent that we just went on. And you were just explaining, before this, we were talking about, the power of sex and sexual energy in ceremony and ritual. And then I want to ask you about the role of psychedelics in this process, be it individualization, or just in general in magical rituals or ceremonies.
But that's another huge subject. The first thing that comes to mind is that it can be very good for this kind of self-knowledge process, which is almost more like meditative or mystical in a way. It's kind of hard to prance around and do magical ritual when you're super high. It's hard to keep that because there needs to be some kind of rational focus if you have like some kind of concrete agenda or an issue that you want to look at. It might just be that you will be looking at that issue from a million different points of view than the one that you are originally planned to do. So in that sense, I think psychedelics are very conducive to self-reflection and to revelation, meaning more to mystical aspects. And mystical aspects as compared to magical, that would be exactly that, going inwards, trying to find answers within yourself. Some people would call that something spiritual. I prefer to call it inner and outer. But psychedelics are, for me, more conducive for an inner exploration. And that could be all together with other people, that's fine. But when you have this sort of magical agenda, that you have a time space, and you're supposed to do something to program either yourself or the universe or whatever you're up to, that can be kind of hard because it's hard to keep that sort of causal agenda or causal focus during that psychedelic journey.
But there is a role that drugs play in magical ritual, though. I mean, psychedelic is a very specific term for a very specific type, reasonably specific type of drug. But then I'm thinking of, and man, I almost feel shame for not remembering his name, but the author who wrote Prometheus Rising.
Robert Anton Wilson.
Right. Didn't he also write a book about sex and drugs and sex magic? And so what is the role that drugs can play in a magical ritual?
Well, I think, again, I would say, I mean, in ritual, I'm sure it could have many beneficial aspects. My experience is that it can, if you're doing something physically that has an agenda that is sort of set before the adventure begins.
Like sex, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good example. Very good example. It might just be that, someone's tiny part of the body becomes so much more interesting than the experience of sharing that physical union, because you can go out on a tangent and get lost in some kind of minute detail. But that's the beauty of it. That little minute detail can be the revealing agent of something that will change your life. So that's the thing. You can never really decide beforehand, now we're going to take this magic potion and then we're going to do this magic. It's kind of hard. However, if you want to go super slow and go into this thing that the old guys talked about, set and setting, and have a very peaceful and calm setting, or the best thing, of course, is out in nature and see what kind of energy comes in from nature, and let that be a guide in terms of some kind of inner journey. To find out more about yourself in a kind of revelation process rather than programming process. Saying I'm enlightened, I'm going to program the cosmos, because who knows what's going to be inside your mind at that programming moment. It might not be the best thing. But in terms of just finding out who you are or deeper aspects of yourself, then it's perfect.
Great.
Or can be. I'm sounding like
perhaps you don't like what you see.
But that can be a beautiful aspect too. And in terms of, you talked about the dark energies and the sort of the Geiger aspect, or the dramatic or dark or darkly romantic aspects, those things come from a need in us to see that, to be indulging in those things that we find fearful. And that's why so many mysteries and so many initiatory rituals are what's called, death and rebirth rituals, where you symbolically die and then you're reborn in the temple, for instance, as a member of a fraternity, or as a new level of the same fraternity. And that's been going on since it's a cliche, but since time immemorial. The Egyptians did it. I'm sure people did it before them too. It's been around forever, and it's still around. So there must be some deeply rooted psychological need in the human mind to go through these things. And one could easily say that I'm not talking now about sort of cannabis usage. I'm talking about, lysergic experiments, something that's heavier, basically, often contain that kind of you meet yourself, and that aspect of yourself sort of gets obliterated, yet you remain, and you come out of it as a new kind of at least clearer person, a person with a clearer vision. And that's what I find frustrating with a lot of people. I'm 52 right now, so and usually that kind of experimentation is something that goes on when you're young, like a teenager or in your 20s, and you have that kind of culture. You live in that kind of culture. But what I find frustrating is that I feel that I very much integrated the knowledge and the revelations that I got, and I'm working with them. To this day, I'm working with them, and I've had fairly few replenishment sessions, to be diplomatic. And I felt no need to have any. But what's frustrating is that so many other people had similar kinds of enlightenment, similar kinds of illuminations and self-revelations, but they never really got around to integrating them. And that I find frustrating from a cultural point of view, because a culture that doesn't encourage young people to have these kinds of experience, that's the first thing. That's a bad culture. That's a culture that's not building a good, solid, hopeful, optimistic culture. And then, of course, the reason why people, fall back into the old mold, or that they become normal in a way, thinking rationally and inside the box, it's simply because that's what the culture dictates, and it's kind of sad.
Well, I'm definitely there with you on that. I'm a little apprehensive to fully get on board with encouraging youth to radically and to trip a lot of psychedelics, especially in a social environment where there isn't really a lot of cultural container or whatever. Yeah. I would love to see it set up so that there are support structures, and this feels like a dirty word, but social institutions that give space for young people to trip psychedelics and go off in the woods and have these types of revelations. It doesn't exist now, and because of this, good drug, bad drug dichotomy, and because of the stigma, it does invite behaviors that I've suggested in my own book or in my own lectures that when kids are taught that drugs are bad, they inherently believe themselves to be bad when doing drugs, and thus they're likely to do things that are bad or like basically harmful or self-harmful, when none of that needed to exist if there was just a better education and a proper, institutional support structure for kids to experiment with what they obviously want to experiment. They want to have sex and they want to trip drugs. Not all of them, but for the most part, that's what they want to do. Like, especially in your late teenage years, like you want to explore. I think that's why people in their 20s, when they become of age here in Canada, start getting obliteratedly drunk because they want to know what that's like, and there isn't good institutions around safe use.
Yeah, no, I think that would be like a superb definition of something could be called higher learning. I think that should actually be part of some kind of educational system. Absolutely, again, for those who so desire.
Right.
Because I don't think actually that everyone would benefit from it. Some people are just different, or maybe not as strong mentally. It could be individually from for traumatic reasons, or it could just be some kind of fundamental change or differences between people. But for me, it's been very, very helpful and beneficial, and I have no shame or qualms about talking about that. Not at all. I know other people do, and I find that very strange.
Well, we are definitely in a similar boat on that, because I feel very good about my experiences. I do often find myself wanting to, because we're on this podcast, you've obviously checked out what my content was like before you came on. It's clear it's a psychedelic podcast, and I talk a lot about psychedelics and the power and potential of it, but I'll still hesitate and try to justify and explain if I'm talking to certain people, so that they don't trivialize the thing that's so meaningful to me. And I understand that that comes from some sort of deep insecurity or maybe inadequacy in my own self-confidence. But I definitely notice it's there, despite when I'm in my more empowered state, I'd wear it on my shirt. Like I am a psychedelic person. I like psychedelics on the back in bigger letters, So yeah, I appreciate you unashamedly announcing that and giving me space to do the same.
No, it's just it just needs to happen. It just needs to happen at this point in time and space. And I think also, I think I mentioned that speculation in the book also, that I think there's a reason. I think humans, as any sentient beings, or as one humanity, everything is geared towards survival. We want to survive. So I think there's a reason why it coincided, the development of atomic energy and the negative usages. I don't know if there are any good usages of atomic energy, but the distinctly negative ones in terms of warfare and atomic bombs. Yeah. At the same time popped up Albert Hoffman and this sort of distillation or refinement of what became lysergic acid or LSD. I find it so interesting, and I've tried to look at other eras in history where these things have coincided, and it's often when there's a need because of disaster and chaos and dire straits and big plagues, whatever, there will be something popping up as a saving grace. And I think after the First World War, which is sort of mechanical slaughter, and then the Second World War and the atomic energy, I think it could have gone literally straight to hell hadn't this beautiful Swiss scientists been able to refine that little chemical.
Well, absolutely, because the role LSD played in the anti-war movement in the United States during the Vietnam era is like it's really undeniable.
Yeah, and also in terms of developing tech, the major tech developers, like the big tycoons now, some dead, some living, they were all touched by that agent. So it's interesting, and I think it's again that's the reason why, for instance, 150 years ago or further back in time, it was completely stigmatized. You couldn't even talk about the things that we're talking about today. There were inquisitions and witch trials and all these strange Christian fantasies becoming a very stark and the draconian reality. But now we can sit here freely and talk about this, and I've just published this book which talks about these things from a new perspective, from a new context. It's not something arcane, dangerous, hidden, dark. It's something that is totally applicable in each and everyone's lives. And I'm not selling magic. That's not the thing. I'm not telling people to do this. I'm just looking at it from a cultural perspective, saying that this has always existed. And now that we're here, we can change the terminology, break away from this strange old arcane dusty stuff and call it something else instead. That's totally possible. And it will still contain the same, constructive, proto-creative seed and energy.
Well, that leads me into my next set of questions, sort of the second last set of questions. And also, I just want to make a comment about LSD and tech industry and being able to sort of challenge convention and build new ways of communicating things, new topics. I mean, communication technology is a huge part of that. The very fact that you and I are having our conversation, I mean, the book, we could have gotten connected by the book had Skype and digital communication happened, might have wrote you a letter, but these types of conversations and the massive influx of communication technology, has been a huge contributor to the shifting and transformation of ideas, but
absolutely.
But it's also had a negative impact as well, and that's kind of what I want to get into here, because framing this, we've had this talk now about the power of imagination and magical ritual ceremony, self-transformation, and we say imagination from the perspective you're talking about. A lot of that, I don't think you've used the word, but it's in creativity, and what is like one of the most obvious representations of a pure state of creativity, if not art, this sort of artifact of a creative process, which is a type of magical process. And you talk in the book about the value of art within individualization. I keep saying that word wrong, and magic, but you're also quite critical of modern art, and you're also critical of sort of the contemporary modern art form that is mass media culture, which very much is an art form which is using specific techniques and intentions to, in the terminology we're using here, magically make magical changes in the world by making magical changes in the mind of the person. So I guess this is a two-part question, and it's like, maybe just explain and expand on the value of the artistic process in magical ritual ceremony, etc., and the dangers that we're in right now with the impact of mass media culture on our capacity to produce art.
Yeah, no, that's I was going to say legitimate questions. I mean, like that, they're really good questions. I think that first of all, the kinship between art and magic, that's something that's very easy to see and easy to look at historically. The first, cave paintings and the ritual objects, they were all, created by artisanship and skilled, more or less skilled capacity for painting or singing or dancing or carving things, basically super creative processes. And it wasn't for entertainment, it wasn't for kicking back and relaxing after a hard day's work on the steps, but it was more like saying that this is what we desire, let's create this in our little small magical totem factory here. And that's how it's always been. Human beings have always painted or created the divine, ideal aspects, something to strive for. And then, of course, controlled during the millennia and centuries by, again, these power structures saying you can only paint these kinds of things from our religion. But artists have always been a bit devious and magically sort of interwoven their own symbolisms, and maybe despite the fact that they can't, maybe they integrate a little nipple here and there,
just pushing like, the taboos, like you had said earlier, freeing energy.
Yeah. And then today we have Facebook, pushing the trying to ban the nipple, but it's so it's the same kind of process. But it's also schematically the same, meaning that You have something that's desired, something that is clear in your inner vision, and then you basically create it in could be in your pure imagination, meaning there's nothing tangible, but it could also be like with a small talismanic object or an artwork that is more or less, elaborate, having the function. It's functional. The function of the totem or the talisman is to make it happen on a larger scale. And again, that's something that kids are very good at. And it's something inherent in the human creativity. Kids can play with sticks and stones. They can assume roles, saying, I will be this one, you will be that one. And then you don't even have to discuss it because that's a fact in that play zone. So that's a super magical thing, and that could lead on to other discussions why that disappears when you grow up. But that I would say it's a cultural thing. But again, what I suggest in the book and in lectures and stuff is that the reason why the occult, this environment, the magical community, if there is such a thing, has become quite conservative and rigid and dusty, it's because they use the same terminology as has been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So if the processes are the same, what will happen if we just exchange and get an artistic terminology apply them on the same processes? What will happen then? And I mean, it's theoretical speculation, but I've also, and that's another chapter in the book, this thing about the mega golem, where I wanted to create an artwork that is completely non-tangible. And that leads on to the criticism of the modern art world. I find it so devoid of imagination, devoid of fantasy, devoid of genuine creativity. It's all intellectual. It's like intellectual constructions that can't stand on its own 2 feet.
Right, or intellectual deconstructions.
That too. But then even the deconstructions need to be explained.
Yeah.
It's like this constant influx of words that have no meaning at all, and it becomes. And I know I'm very critical, and what began as something beautiful and funny and humorous and satirical and very intelligent with Marcel Duchamp and the surrealists and stuff like that, that created a huge change. But the people doing the same thing today, that's like. I don't know, it's some kind of intellectual masturbation. It leads, nowhere. So I apply that kind of criticism also on contemporary technology, what you call mass media thing, because basically, just like art has the potential to really, truly set you free, technology today has that too. I mean, we work with these wonder machines so much. You and I can talk, and we can create movies and music, all kinds of things, and it's just amazing. But at the same time, you and I are aware of that, and we use it consciously. But most people using the internet and using computers, I would say they're not doing that. They're only taking in passive input.
Well, I gotta admit that there's my struggle with technology. I am also taking in that passive, and I think that the negative impact that we're talking here about taking in the passive technology is going to be something that we look back on in 20 years and be in the same way that we look back on the premise of smoking in the 20s and 30s.
Oh, yeah.
We look back and it was so bad for us, or I think we're going to look back on things like Facebook in 20, 30 years and basically feel the same. And I'm wrapped up in it as much as the
same here, and I totally agree. And that's one of the reasons, because there's one text in the book that maybe doesn't really belong there, but I still wanted it in there, and that's something that I wrote for a Norwegian art magazine, and that's the one called Pokemon Go Away.
Yeah, I like that one actually.
Yeah. No, because that it's just so depressing to me to see that actual little scene on that street corner where a father and his son and maybe some friends of the son, they were just staring, looking into the void and then down into their phones, and it was just like they were mentally challenged in a way. And they were playing Pokemon Go. For me, it was just like you have kids who have such wonderful imaginations, and they can concoct these vistas, these dramas, these plays, which are psychodramas, then why would you need a little Japanese, ghost-like technological figure tell them where they are, and the human beings obey them and go looking for them? To me, it's I don't know, it's completely depressing.
Yeah, it's definitely explained that way. It feels pretty depressing.
Yeah.
I can see some benefits to Pokemon Go. I mean, this is getting a little off, but if you look at people who are already stuck in that depressing place and now they're doing it outside in the sunshine with other people, I mean, like, there is a step forward in that regards, right?
Okay, yeah, I can buy that one.
So then what else do you see as the negative impact here of this pop media? And I'm thinking for myself, you made a comment, and I'm going to just paraphrase it. I have it written down here, is that that there is an impact on the contemporary mass media on our higher capacities in regards to creativity and individual empowerment. And what comes up for me is that I notice that sometimes, and I know I'm not alone in this, I hit a hardcore Netflix binge on some sort of incredible show, which I know is specifically designed to hook me in for all 15 hours of it. And I noticed that afterwards, the thoughts that are just passively roaming through, like the default mode network, is retelling the characters, the stories, these things. I'm thinking about this fictional media and not like mythical importance. I don't have any attachment to it at all. Like deep psychologically, it's purely aesthetic and entertainment wise. And I think I kind of went off, not sure where I was going, but like, that's the point. I see something really, really damaging and negative there. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can, and this is only just like spontaneous speculation, because I know exactly what you mean. I tried to avoid it for a long time, but being a movie buff, and I've always loved movies and stuff like that, I knew that there was an allure and a kind of a danger in the series, because it's not a movie that's 2 hours. It's something that takes away like maybe 20 hours or even more.
Till like 3 or 4 in the morning, where you have no more willpower and you have no conscious discernment at all.
Exactly. So I would say that if we return to the mythical, that a great movie, like for instance, I would say that, The Lord of the Rings, meaning those 3 first movies, they're great mythological movies. They're really good. But that's, of course, because they're based on really good books that were, packing a mythological punch. But if you want, for instance, one thing I saw, Vikings. I've been watching all the episodes of Vikings in a fairly short amount of time, and it's fascinating and it's well done and it's super, adventurous and stuff like that. But it carries absolute zero mythological punch, although it has the potential to carry that. Meaning, it's set in a different time, a culture that's my own, basically, the Scandinavian, and it could be filled with so much good stuff beyond the mere entertainment, but it's not. It's only there for me to sit and stare and be passively entertained. There's nothing beneficial about it. Whereas, watching Lord of the Rings could actually, I felt that when I saw that on a big screen, it was a really powerful experience. I love those films.
That lack of myth, that was the point that I got lost in, because I explained something else, which is that I feel that what's happening is that I feel mythically impoverished. I have really no connection to my ancestry, because I am the multi-generational product of immigrants from another country that came to Canada to help unconsciously participate in the devastation of the people here. And to set up this consumer, I don't have any particular issues with capitalism, but I do have issues with consumerism. And we've set up this consumer capitalist heritage where the big myths behind the point and purpose of my life is either established in the dogma of religious institutions, which I subsequently rejected, and the dogma of the a priori of economic development, particularly on the consumption of natural, just consumption, period, right? And that I'm mythically impoverished. And because of that, there's a part of me that is desperate for something of real inherent meaning that my life is totally devoid of, because I don't have these underlying myths that sort of inform the epicness of my life. Yeah. And so I reach to something to give me that epicness. And then, so it's like these shows, I think that they really catch us in a way, because it's like they work as a surrogate to a mythically inspired life. But
totally.
They're also a toxic mimic, because they negatively impact. I know I'm going off on my own little soapbox here, so thank you for giving me the space. I was talking with a friend of mine about Black Mirror. Actually, this guy's name is, I'll just promo him because he's a DJ or a music producer named Goopstep. He's very good. And I was talking about it with him, and about how just devastating it is to watch these shows, which is interesting in its own right. But he made this comment, which was something along the lines of he had watched a few episodes and then he stopped watching it. And he stopped watching it because he's like, why would I spend my days depressed because of this, like these stories written by somebody else about something totally fictional, when I could be spending my energy in writing the epic story that is my life?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's well put. And I think most intelligent people who have, that kind of drive, I don't think it's a generational thing. I think it exists in all generations. If you have the drive, you will get out of that morass of passivity, basically. Because for me, the series, they're can at least be entertaining and relaxing, although they take a lot of time. But there's something I find even more depressing, and that's gaming, where people spend an equal amount of time on the surface being active. But on the other hand, I can say that they're even more passive, although their fingers, they shoot and they do things and they, control a keyboard and stuff like that. It's still like, totally blanking, because it's focused on an absolute nothing. When you see something like a series or a movie, that's, at least there's some kind of something that, brings out emotional stuff, even if it's super superficial. I just find gaming so depressing. But that could be a generational thing, because I also, have some younger friends, and they play these computer games, and they say it's fun, and they say it's exciting and stuff like that. I can't really argue.
There's also, again, the same criticism or the same possible benefit to Pokemon Go is like possibly these people weren't going to go out and do anything anyways, but now they have these online communities of friends that have a shared interest.
Oh, totally. But it's interesting to see also that I get this sort of dystopian visions that they're training themselves to be future war gun fodder. Like they sit on these terminals and just play these things.
Ready Player One.
Yeah, exactly. And then when the real shit hits the real fan, it's not going to be, it's going to be game over for real. And I think that also when you're being imprinted with this kind of interacting, that is mostly, if I understand things correctly, it's all negative. It's all violence, and the games are super violent, and there's either fictional stuff in terms of zombies and supernatural creatures, or there's warfare, or there's space aliens, and it's all about getting ecstatic and enthusiastic about brutal violence.
Which I don't necessarily think, well, because I have it in myself. I used to have quite an obsession with gore films and horror games and all this stuff. And I appreciate it when there's a really good quality rendered graphic of an exploding head. I mean, like there's an art to that, right? So, but I can see how, especially for men, though I don't want to unfair genderize this topic, but there's like a primordial warriorship in a lot of men, right? There's this predator psychology. And it can be exercised in violent gaming. However, exercise in violent gaming could always remain in this like other world. It's never myth. It's always entertainment.
Exactly.
And if somebody forges their whole identity around entertainment, I mean, like you had said, it could negatively impact the capacity for willful and competent direction of energy at the very least.
Yeah. And also I think that it's not only lacking in myth, this thing with the violence thing. It's also something that should be handled in initiatory rites, where you get to experience it in a symbolic way, and that could be quite enough, but this is all just this strange gray area where you think you're active, but in actual fact you're super passive. It's very strange.
I just want to shout out right now to Tony Hawk Pro Skater on my Retro N64. I know we're talking negative about gaming, but I really like that. So let's tie it all back for the final question here. Back into, all of what we've been talking about here is clearly has a relationship to magic, and has a relationship to be occult, like the hidden, and for example, the hidden impact of this media, and also the hidden intentions of mass psychology and propaganda manipulation of the human mind. But specifically in regards to magical ritual or engaging magic in life, what would you say is the best and most effective way for people to start thinking about and applying magic in their lives today? Just like the single best piece of advice, as well as the most important piece of caution you would add to it.
Well, I think that the best advice is so corny and old school, but it's still the best thing, and that's simply to go out into nature.
That doesn't sound corny to me at all, Carl. That sounds great.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah.
No, I think that's because we're so trapped in all of these sort of screens, and we think that everything is contained, but there's nothing like nature. Nature has everything that we really need, and I mean that both on a physical level and metaphysical level, and it could be anything from just taking an extensive walk or a hike in beautiful nature, or even in a park. I mean, I've had like totally beatific inner visions in Central Park in New York on a summer's day.
Well, Central Park is not your typical park. That is basically the wild, right?
Yeah. No, but what I mean is that it doesn't need to be sort of super romantic. You don't have to go into Yosemite or into the Canadian wilderness, or just to be immersed in nature, the chlorophyllc saturation, and breathe, and then you can, if you want to, just maybe spend more time, go on an overnight hike, camp out, stuff like that. Just expose yourself to something that is not electric, artificial, digital, like that, and see what comes up in your mind. Most likely for people who are completely urban, there will be fears. There will be fears, fears of exposure, fears of the wild, fears of darkness, fears of the silence and all the sounds you can hear in the silence.
Or of bears, for example.
Yeah, that could be a real
bears and cougars if you're out west.
Yeah. But still, just to allow yourself to meet that primal response in your own system, that's a good place to start. And then, of course, if you're not exposed to cougars and bears, maybe just have try out some meditation, because again, that's the first beautiful steps of individuation. It's not going, mental or wacky in terms of doing rituals to get everything fast and get to know yourself fast, instant. Doesn't work that way. It's much better to go slow, meditate, think about, what you like, dislike, maybe even go for like a that would be like a dualistic thing, make a list of things that exist in your life, and then just go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. That's a very dualistic method. But just to single out what you really get off on, what you really like, what's meaningful to you. And that kind of super simple, yet also super efficient techniques.
Well, that actually aligns with Jung too. I think it was, was it Jung or Campbell that said, follow your bliss, which is like your excitement, your passion, the thing that you care about.
Yeah, I would say that's Joseph Campbell, but still, Jung would have approved, absolutely.
And so then, what would be the piece of caution?
Well, I think that the greatest piece of caution, because if you go into this process of individuation with, a clear mind and an honesty, no self-deceit, nothing, then you will. That's a given. You will see yourself in a clearer light. You will know yourself better. And that's where the caution comes in. Then you can't really back away, because if you back away from your own crystal clear reflection in the mirror, then you will be endlessly plagued by frustrations. So in a way, it's just like it's a one-way trip. You can't go to Blissland and then go back, because you will always long for Blissland again.
Right. Why, oh, why didn't I take the blue pill? Right?
Exactly. Or the yellow brick road or whatever symbol you want to have, is that if you go on this path, on this symbolic and also concrete journey, then you have to be ready for the fact that what you learn about yourself, that may not take you in the direction that other people want you to take. Or even that you thought when you were younger that you wanted to take. And you have to be ready for those challenges and just face the facts and say, the person I thought that I was, that's not really me, and then you have to have the courage to break away and just follow that path instead.
Which requires sometimes a lot of courage and confrontation with a lot of dark material.
Oh, absolutely. But that's exactly what the magical process is about. Exactly that. And you could equally well call it individuation. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's sort of the adventure of life in a way.
Great. Well, Carl, thank you so much for your time here on the show. To cap this interview, maybe you can let the listeners know where they can find out more about your work and where they might be able to follow you on social media and details about your new book.
Absolutely. The book is called Occulture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. It's published by Inner Traditions, or actually one of their imprints. And it's available everywhere. You can get it on Amazon or any online booksellers or major booksellers, Occulture. And then in terms of finding me, there are two main websites that are contain everything. The first one is my first and last name as one word, carlabrahamsson.com, Abrahamsson with two S's and Carl with a C. So that's carlabrahamsson.com. And the second one is a Patreon site that I have together with my wife. So that's patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. So that's patreon.com/Vanessa23 and Carl.
Excellent. I'll make sure there are links to both of those.
Yeah, that's great.
And also on the show notes.
If there's anything else you need, just email me in terms of that kind of stuff.
Right. Cool. Oh, you're talking to me directly about emailing you.
I am.
Great. I'll do that. I'll get your Twitter handle and all those things later.
If people want to do that, that's fine too. They can do that via both those sites I said. So that's fine. That will be fine. I like that.
Excellent. So again, thank you very much, Carl, for being on the show. Definitely don't hang up just yet. I want to stick around and ask you some after the credits questions for my patrons on Patreon. But again, thank you very, very much for coming on the show.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks.
And so concludes this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this next couple of minutes. I want to thank my patrons on Patreon for making this show possible. I couldn't do it without you, and a special thank you to the people whose names are written in the description to this episode. Another thanks to the people who are leaving one-time PayPal or crypto donations. This is also thoroughly supportive. I invite you, the listener, if you haven't yet and you feel inspired to support this show, to please head over to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to become a patron of the show here, or by dropping me a PayPal donation. I really deeply appreciate it. Thank you. Links are in the description to this episode. Finally, as you hopefully heard in the intro, is I am just launching a merch store through my website, because I understand that Patreon and donations are not for everyone, and I would like to be able to create amazing artifacts, artifacts of the podcast, while also contributing to raising funds for this show. And the first piece of merch that is going to be launched through this store is some limited edition blotter art. Of course, this blotter art does not contain any actual drugs, nor does it come in contact with any drugs. It is art, and it is hopefully for you to frame frame and put up on your wall, though it does come in a very nice mylar archival plastic wrapping. Each one is numbered. There's a limited of 100. There will only ever be 100 of these, and each one is signed and numbered. On top of funding the podcast, that helps to contribute to the investments I am currently making in getting some great audio video gear to record podcasts on the road while I am touring through Europe this summer. So thank you very much in advance for getting your custom blotter art, or for becoming my patron, or for even just listening to this show all the way to the end. I thank you, and I also love doing this, and you help me do it, so thanks. Until the next episode, this is James W. Jesso signing off from Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.